Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to our virtual program of the night. My name is Ivan Salinas, and I'm the programs coordinator here at Beyond Baroque. I have the honor of introducing and hosting the second installment of Poets Translate Poets, translating the avant-garde across borders. Before we get started, I'd like to share a few words about Beyond Baroque. We're an organization located in Venice, California, dedicated to the artistic possibilities of language by cultivating new writing, presenting contemporary literature and art, and building a diverse community of poets, writers, and artists. I'd like to acknowledge our presence on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Gabrielino Tonga peoples. We acknowledge the wrong done to these peoples through settler colonialism and genocidal practices. As a literary arts organization, we're committed to uplifting Indigenous communities, their stories, and cultures. It's April, and we're celebrating National Poetry Month. We have a full slate of programs in person, including a reading this Saturday on April 16, which is in tandem with our current gallery exhibit, 7x7 artist and writer collaborations. And on Friday, April 22, we'll be hosting LA Poet Laureate Lynn Thompson and author Nikki Beer. And also on April 30th, we'll be hosting our first ever International Poetry Film Festival. So if you're local to the LA area, come and visit us at any of our upcoming events. We also have our bookstore open Fridays and Saturdays. Feel free to find more info about these events on our website and on our social media. The links will be shared via the chat. And also keep an eye out for our intensive workshops. We have a poetry performance workshop with Mary Lou Newmark and another poetry workshop with Tracy Kato Kirayama. You can sign up also through our website, and you can find the links to those in the chat. If you can support, consider donating to Beyond Baroque through our website, as it helps us to continue offering free programming as much as we can, and consider becoming a Beyond Baroque member. But most importantly, please consider buying our authors' books. We've created a book list with titles from each of our featured poet translators tonight. These will be available through a link shared in the chat. And you can purchase these books. You will be supporting our bookstore as well via bookshop.org. To get us started, we'll be having an introduction from Beyond Baroque's board vice president, Ramon Garcia, who curated and co-organized tonight's reading, and will say a few words to lead us into this wonderful reading that explores poetry emerging from various avant-garde literary movements, as well as a discussion among the panelists. Ramon is a bilingual poet with several books published, both poetry and essays, and he is a university professor in the Chicano Studies Department at California State University, Northridge. So please, let's give a warm welcome to Ramon Garcia.
Thank you, Ivan. I want to thank Assistant Director Jimmy Vega, Ivan Salinas, our programs coordinator and Poetry Coalition Fellow, as well as fellow board members on the programming committee for making this series possible. Its aim is to fulfill one of the goals in Beyond Baroque's mission statement, which is, quote, to provide challenging program of events which promotes new work and diversity, end quote. With this goal in mind, I'm very pleased to welcome our invited poets and everyone joining us tonight for the second of a series which we initiated last year entitled Poets Translate Poets, this time focused on the historical avant-garde on both sides of the border. The avant-garde is framed by the various movements in poetic language in both the English-speaking world and in Latin America. In the US Anglo-American context, there is imagism and deep image, Black Mountain, concrete and objectivist poetry, the beats, the Black arts movement, ethnic poetics, language poetry, new formalism, new narrative, etc. In the Latin American context, poetic language was advanced by los contemporáneos, ultraísmo, creacionismo, estridentismo, surrealismo, antipoesía, infrarrealismo, etc. The cross-pollination of poetic language, often in translation, between North American and Mexican poets has enriched poetry on both sides of the border. The poets and translators joining us represent some of the most significant and productive practices in poetic language in both countries. The format is as follows: remarks by poet translators regarding specific avant-garde poetics in their work as poets and translators, followed by a reading of a poem they have translated in both its original version and their translation. And finally, the poets will read one of their own poems. Afterward, we'll open it up for discussion amongst our invited poet translators and everyone who is joining us tonight. I hope that you enjoy the program. And I give it back to Ivan.
Yeah, gracias, Ramon. So before I introduce our first guest, we're also going to be sharing a PDF that includes the poems to be read tonight. You will see the link to that in the chat. Most of the poems have both the English and Spanish translations, so feel free to read along with the poets during the program. And like Ramon said, there will be a discussion and Q&A after the readings. So now I will introduce our first reader. To start us off, we're going to invite Tedi López Mills. Tedi López Mills was born in Ciudad de Mexico. She is the author of more than a dozen books, including both poetry and essays, several of which have received national literary prizes. 3 books have been published in English: While Light is Built, Death on Rua Augusta, and Against the Current. In the coming months, Deep Vellum will be bringing out Book of Explanations, a volume of essays. So please let's welcome Tedi López Mills.
Done. Sorry. Good night to everyone, and thank you very much for including me in this discussion. I don't know how to begin, so I'll barge in the avant-garde, which is a very a territory filled with strife, filled with difficulties, and in the case of Mexico, as I was mentioning before in our pre-discussion, it's a constant battleground. I had many discussions with an Argentinian poet who founded a very interesting magazine here in Mexico. The poet was called Hugo Gola, who said that basically Mexico had no avant-garde whatsoever. And he would never have included Octavio Paz as an avant-garde poet. He said that basically Mexican poetry was too, let's say, too transparent, too completely defined by vocabulary in the sense of words that have to match with objects to really be an avant-garde poetry. And at the same time, there's always the problem between poetry and politics in the avant-garde. And in Mexico, that's a very crucial and a very intense problem. In any case, that's kind of like just an opener. I was reading also in the morning, I was rereading Medusario, which is a very interesting anthology done by Jacobo Stefani, Jose Coser, and has a very interesting introduction by Roberto Tejada and Nestor Perlonguer, which are 2 great avant-garde poets. And one of the things that struck me, they're very interesting ideas in both introductions, but one of the things that struck me and that I find that connects in some ways with the poem that I translated by John Ashbery is how in both of these introductions, they never mention the reader, what relationship the reader establishes with the poem. And in the case of Baroque or avant-garde poetry, the reader is always in a very strange place. The poem I'm going to read by John Ashbery is called Disorder and Light, which I think is an excellent title for Baroque poetry or avant-garde poetry. And for me, it represents a very special case of problem in translation, because something that happens when you translate Baroque poetry or avant-garde poetry is that you understand it, but at the same time, you don't understand it. So in many senses, you are translating with your eyes shut or with your mind shut, because you don't understand, because the poem in a certain way is happening outside the poem. In the case of this Ashbury poem, it's almost like when you say off Broadway, it's off poetry. It's poetry that's happening outside the poem. And it is happening, it definitely is there, but you don't necessarily see it on the surface. And I think the word surface is very important in the case of avant-garde or Baroque poetry, because surface is where everything is supposed to be happening. It comes up to the surface. I don't know if I'm going on to, if I said anything really very clear, but this poem is called Disorder and Light. It was published by John Ashbery in it was the time of his death in 2017. So I'll read it first in English, and then I'll read my translation. I must say that I'm not completely satisfied. When I reread it now, I'm not completely satisfied with that translation, because it really is, it doesn't stay in its place. But I must say that the Ashbury poem doesn't stay in its place either. It's almost like it's a poem that's talking to itself more than talking to the reader. Disorder and Light. Answer, I would dump it. She lost her husband. It was time. The more blurry it's going to be, the great complicator takes us all into account. I don't know what this is, remnant. You won't get there forever. Decades ago, after the dogs inspected it, it became part of their repertory. Comes in and ankles around like he owned the place, which he did in a sense. Fast action on their part drew her on. This wasn't morning. It was more like a week from now. I'll be on your side, searching for what we both know is there, our crumbling infrastructure. You stay out of it. You've got to be kidding me. Your pill, he urged. Have a wild breakfast, eyed and mulled. There you go, passionate as a song. I mean, that's what he told us to say. The trees seem to agree. I don't know if you get the sense in the poem of how the poem is outside of the poem, not only inside. And it was very difficult to translate. I don't know if I cleared things up that I shouldn't have cleared up in my translation. John Ashbery, Desorden y Luz. Respuesta, lo tiraría. Ella perdió a su marido, ya era hora. Cuanto más borroso se pone, el gran complicador nos toma a todos en cuenta. No sé lo que es esto, residuo. No llegarás allá para siempre. Hace décadas, luego de que los perros lo inspeccionaran, se convirtió en parte de su repertorio. Entra y se desplaza a sus anchas como si el lugar fuera suyo. Lo es en cierto sentido. Un rápido movimiento por parte de ellos la trajo. No era la mañana, era más como la semana próxima. Estaré de tu lado, buscando lo que los dos sabemos está ahí, nuestra infraestructura ruinosa. Tú no te metas, no lo puedo creer. Tu pastilla me instó. Cómanse un desayuno salvaje, escrutado y rumiado. Allá vas, pasional como una canción. Bueno, es lo que nos dijo que dijéramos. Los árboles parecen estar de acuerdo. So that's the translation. I don't know. I don't know how much time I have, Ivan.
You're good on time. Yeah.
Because I was thinking that I would like, just kind of, because discussing, I'm kind of like in a void right now. I'd like to read my poem in Spanish and the translation, because I think the mirror effect is always interesting, what I did and what the translator did. So I think I'll take advantage of the time. My poem is a very short poem. If you think that works, Ivan, is that all right?
Sí.
This is from Against the Current, which is definitely a Baroque, I don't know if it's a Baroque book, but it's a Baroque attempt. And I don't know if it's an avant-garde book, but it does kind of follow through, it does go through the motions. Contémplalo, mi trozo de mundo, mi invertido paraíso de hoja rala, mi entronque de grava con polvo. Mide el día filtrado por la madera, su tiempo de menos tras la columnata de árboles, su vestigio de una vista en la reincidencia del campo. Huele la peste en lo que medra, la hierba mala, la hierba de espina, la que se enrosca símil mastrance por el rabo en vaivén de una vaca. Escucha el timbre de último día en el mugido, las campanas detrás resonando con ese dolor semejante, la herida a conciencia que socava el destino desigual de un cuerpo, y pregunta, ¿qué conoces? Cacharro de mustios reflejos, suena a verdad la mentira, el ser ahí con la sonaja de un pensamiento adentro, leve estribillo, ese soy lo que soy, vaca, oveja, borrego, el venado de las visiones, el ciervo de la nieve del poema de una duda. ¿Queda vida tras la imagen? Nieve de sol negro escuché alguna vez, promontorio blanco en la noche. Hay cola para presenciar el desenlace. Mi paraíso tendrá los mismos tonos, los mismos matices ideológicos, mi omisión perpetua ante la causa, que este día de lucro para la sombra. Consider it, my bit of earth, my inverted paradise bereft of leaves, where gravel intersects with dust. Measure the day filtered by branches, its time slipping away behind the avenue of trees, its vestigial panorama on the relapsing field. Smell the stench in what thrives, weeds, burrs, what curls, simulant trance around the cow's twitching tail. Listen to the last day's timbre of its lowing, then the bells ringing out with a like pain, fervent wound eroding the body's fickle destiny, and ask, what do you know? Heap of rusty reflections, lie that smacks of truth, being there with a rattle of inner thought, light refrain, I am what I am, cow, sheep, lamb, dream-like deer, snowy stag from a poem that doubts, is there life behind the image? Snow's black sun I heard once, night's white promontory. They're all lining up for the finale. My paradise will have the same shades, same ideological intimations, avoiding, as I always do, the cause, as this day that prophets shadows. And I think I will end there. I hope this opens up a discussion of some kind. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, Teddy. Thank you for sharing your own poem as well, that you decided to do so. It was wonderful. And now we'll be moving on with our second reader of the night. Jerome Rothenberg is an internationally celebrated poet, translator, and performer with over 90 books of poetry and 12 assemblages of traditional and avant-garde poetry, such as Technicians of the Sacred and Poems for the Millennium. In addition to the numerous translations that appeared in these anthologies, his work as a translator has included books of translations from Lorca, Nesval, Schwitters, Gombringer, and Picasso. His most recent big books are Eye of Witness, a Jerome Rothenberg reader, and Barbaric, Vast and Wild, both published by Black Widow Press. A new book of poems he is currently completing with Mexican poet Javier Taboada, an anthology of North and South American poetry from prehistoric origins to the present, scheduled for publication next year by University of California Press. Now, let's welcome Jerome Rothenberg.
Now I am unmuted. I won't be referring to the new big book that was just mentioned. But in some sense, it's a feeling that I have and Javier Taboada along with me, that the sense of the avant-garde goes back, as the book does, 2,000 years and more. So it's the mix of the old and the new. As it is old, it is new, said Gertrude Stein. As it is new, it is old. And now we have come to be in our own way, which is a completely different way. For me, the great poet that opened me up through translation was Garcia Lorca. And though he's not quite Latin American, the influence is international, and the connection to the avant-garde is unquestioned. So I will read something that I wrote about Lorca. I will read the opening small section from a longer series of interconnected poems called Newton, which comes in an early book of Lorca's called The Suites, is the musical term. And I will read my translation in full. And a further variation off the vocabulary of Lorca in my translation, which is my own avant-garde gesture. Lorca was the first poet I ever translated. A ballad or romance called Preciosa y el aire, worked out but never published when I was still in my teens back in the later 1940s. The translation of Lorca's early poems, The Suites, came some 50 years later, but was submerged in a large collected Lorca translated by a variety of hands. While I had been commissioned to translate The Suites and did so gladly, I felt a great frustration in not being able to publish my translations independently, thus diluting whatever sense I had that I was doing a kind of homage to Lorca. With that, I began to compose a series of poems of my own, variations, that drew systematically on vocabulary, especially nouns and adjectives, from my translations of The Suites, and later from poet in New York as well, but rearranging them in a variety of ways. The methods used resemble chance operations, but with a margin of flexibility, with total freedom in the case of verbs and adverbs, with occasional addresses to Lorca himself embedded in them. The result isn't translation or imitation in any narrow sense, but yet another way of making poetry, and for me at least, a way of coming full circle into a discovery that began with Lorca and for which he has stood with certain others as a guide and constant fellow traveler. One time I was tempted to say, all poetry is translation. All poetry is an othering. I is an other, we all remember. So in the suites, the Newton suite begins. En la nariz de Newton cae la gran manzana, bólido de verdades, la última que colgaba del árbol de la ciencia. El gran Newton se rasca sus narices sajonas. Había una luna blanca sobre el encaje bárbaro de los hayas. A Newton suite. Newton's nose. Onto the nose of Newton, a large apple falls, a meteor of truths, last fruit to dangle from the tree of science, and big Newton scratches his Saxon nostrils, a white moon over those barbaric strings of lace, the beech trees. In the woods, the gnomes astride their secrets tear their beards out. They tie up death and make the echoes mislead men with mirrors. In a corner lies the secret, in the open, dead. His companions mourn him, a blue boy with iron feet, a glowing star between his eyebrows. His companions mourn him, and the green lake trembles in the wind. Harmony. Waves rhyme with sighs and stars with crickets. A tremble in the cornea, the whole cold sky, a dot, a synthesis, infinities. But who joins waves with sighs and stars with crickets? Just hope these geniuses be missing something. The proofs keep drifting by among us. The philosopher's last walk. Newton was taking a walk. Death had followed him, strumming his guitar. Newton was taking a walk. The worms gnawed through his apple. The wind hummed in the trees, the river beneath the branches. Wordsworth would have cried. The philosopher was striking unimaginable poses, was waiting for another apple. He ran along the road. He stretched out by the water. He saw how his face would sink in the moon's reflection. Newton wept. And high up on a cedar, two old owls yammered. Slowly in the night, the wise man went back home. He dreamt enormous pyramids of apples. Replica. Adam ate an apple from the Virgin Eve. Newton was a second Adam. Sciences. The first knew beauty. The second, a Pegasus bowed down by chains, and neither one was guilty. Their two apples, pink and fresh, but with a bitter history. The severed breasts of innocence. Poor child. Question. Why was it an apple and not the orange or the polyhedral pomegranate? Why this virgin fruit to clue them in, this smooth and gentle pippin? What admirable symbol lies dormant at its core? Adam, Paris, Newton carry it inside their souls and fondle it without a clue to what it is. The Lorca Variations, 11. Newton. 1. The men had green feet that vaulted them into the open where they could flaunt their secrets. Lace brushed lightly against their nostrils as the apple tree loomed over Newton with its fruits. It is so Saxon to bind gnomes with string, to watch your echoes drifting off in secret, your lost companions jangling irons in the wind. Not every boy has such sad eyebrows, nor would every corner spare an inch for death. In the woods, the moon showed Newton where the truth lies. Following his nose, he slammed into a meteor named Newton. He mistook it for a science that was white, like beech trees or like beards. But once he caught it in his mirror, saw it turn blue again. At length, it looked like every other star or lake. 2. Every wise man considers himself another Newton, a philosopher musing beside trees and water, going for a walk or coming from a walk, pulling genies out of waves and sky, with which sigh makes a perfect rhyme. Their corneas are focused on infinity and disregard the lowly cricket just as Newton did. And just as Newton knew the wind or Wordsworth knew a certain word to be the night's reflection, so apples floating on a wave of crickets make a synthesis more powerful than stars. Philosophers should play guitars then, reaching for those apple branches where the moon's a lowly apple. Pyramids adorned with owls express a kind of harmony, and stars are dots and are a proof of death more powerful than worms. What if the river strikes a pose? The cedar will show a face that brings it home. 3. There isn't a clue that the fruit into which Adam bit was an apple and not his lady's breast. Above them, Pegasus kept flying past, all in the name of science. The Virgin handed him a second apple, which Adam turned into a questioning of history. Deep in its core, the Virgin saw souls rise and fall, a symbol Newton later found inside a pomegranate. Only a child can play with apples and touch beauty. Newton and Adam both were satisfied with Eve's reply, the first she gave when she woke up in chains, her innocence laid by. Paris, in the other tale, held up an orange. This was later translated into Spanish by Mexican poet Roberto Tejada, but the book was never published. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Jerome. Thank you so much. It's an honor to also have you in the room with us. And also, like you mentioned, though, Lorca being a Spanish poet is so important to authors in Latin America and the US. And thank you for sharing the suites as well. I feel like these are poems that are not as talked about so often. So hopefully we can dig more into some of this in the discussion and the Roberto Yepes translation to be published sometime soon.
Sure.
All right, moving on with our next poet translator of the night. Anthony Seidman is a poet translator from Los Angeles. His poetry, reviews, short fiction, and translations have appeared in publications like World Literature Today, Huizache, Latin American Literature Today, Poetry International, and in journals from England, France, and Latin America. His most recent full-length translations include A Stab in the Dark by Facundo Bernal, Caribbean Ants, selected poems of Homero Pumarol, and most recently, Contra Natura by Rodolfo Inostroza, which won a grant from the Whittier Binner Foundation. Seidman's collections of original poetry include the recent Cosmic Weather and the chapbook, The Defining Crisis of Your Lifetime is Utopia. Please welcome Anthony Seidman.
Pleasure to be here. Can everyone hear me? If you can give me a thumbs up just to make sure, because I have perfect. Wonderful to be here. So I guess I'll start with a short comment about the prompt, which was about the avant-garde in Latin America and how that has influenced me, or it might not have influenced me. And I think I'm perhaps the only Gabacho poet who has been influenced by Jorge Cuesta's Antología de la Poesía Contemporánea. For me, that was an essential anthology. and I really discovered poets that I wish to emulate. And so in some of my books, I even have poems that are based on poems by Pellicer, by the Estrendidistas. So you know, sometimes it's a weird way that one gets influenced by the poetry of different countries. And being an adopted child, and growing up in a multilingual family, I always felt that I was not speaking the correct language. I was always yearning for a different language. And in a certain sense, I think I found a home, un techo, una morada en la poesía mexicana, no? For me, Muerte Sin Fin is like on the same level, the same footing as The Wasteland by T.S. Eliot. These are like very essential poems for me. And then also when we get back to Modernismo, I think we can think about Mexican poets like Efren Rebolledo, who are just profound, interesting, very interesting poets who have not been translated widely into English and who need to be wider celebrated. When it comes to prose, I think Alfonso Reyes is one of the best stylist prose writers. And I think that short story that he wrote, La Cena, which obviously is something that influenced Carlos Fuentes when he wrote Aura, La Cena is something that needs to be translated into English. It's one of these texts that was really showing a keen understanding of surrealism and all the symbolism. And then, by the way, I mean, Luis Cardoso y Aragon, I translated Luna Park. I think he's one of the major poets of the 20th century. So it's very interesting when we talk about Latin American poetry. I always hear the same triumvirate or the same triad or the same trinity, which is always Neruda, Paz, and then you add it. But there seems to be very little interest into really digging into what has been produced in Spanish language poetry. All right, so the purpose of myself being here is to read from my translation of Contra Natura by Rodolfo Nostroza. I'm going to read some sections from his Imitations of Propertius from the Latin poet, from the Roman poet. And I don't think I can, I think I will abstain from reading it in Spanish with this explanation. His poetry is so multilingual. Words switch from Spanish to English to French to Latin terms that in itself, each poem is a type of palimpsest of these different languages and cultures. And then I'll finish with a poem of my own. But again, I wish to emphasize, by the way, there is one thing I forgot to mention. It was very interesting that we started with a conversation about John Ashbery, who is recently deceased. And it brought to mind the conversations when I was living in Ciudad Juarez in Mexico, when Paz passed away. And there was this whole type of rhetoric of like the post-Paz generation. How do we go on from here? Or are we liberated from his indelible influence? And I think the same thing is kind of similar with John Ashbery. I remember when I was at Syracuse University in a creative writing workshop. I'm not going to mention the poet because this almost sounds criminal, but I remember the poet who was leading the workshop saying, "I can't wait for John Ashbery to die. I'm sick of him. He's driving me crazy." Like, you know, it's too much already. All right, so here we go. This is the Imitation of Propertius, my translation into English by the wonderful Peruvian poet Rodolfo Nostroza. And it goes without saying that he won the Maldoror Prize, named after Le Comte de Lautréamont in 1971. and none other than Octavio Paz was the judge. O Caesar, O Demiurge, you who live immersed in power, allow me to live immersed in the word. Shall I sing of your power? Am I going to be drafted? Shall I project slides on the nape of my contemporaries? But your assistant approaches, insisting that I enlist in the movement. If not, I will be abolished by the movement. I will not be recorded in history. Not in your history, O Caesar. 80 battalions will burn my poems, claiming that they were useless and crude. There is no accord with official history, but my poems shall be read by innumerable groups of clochards, sous le petit point, and they will, sous le petit pont, sorry, and they shall guide me towards Azucena's thighs, for they temporarily will provide to be an excessive communicating thing. Sous le petit pont, talking about time without political implications, runs the Seine, river of cherries, limpid river, and by 6 o'clock evening, things become natural. And you shall not have me, O Caesar, feel particularly racked with guilt on account of the starving millions. 2. The imbeciles have renounced power. I confess myself to be an imbecile. That pragmatic and savage game in which I bellow and flee, in which I have charred half of my youth, just to accept your reality, O Caesar, to recite my Shakespearean mouthful, and thus the time one passes on earth proves miserable, if one supposes there is no infinity, and besides, the world for which I fancied myself mediator never existed, and my days will never gaze upon it. A useless puto, according to the records of your state, lord of great power. A festive youth, nonsense. I shall sing to the laughter and the ridicule. Those are certainly the immortal things, not your power, your barbarism, O Caesar. I flee, chucking beer cans at America, according to the way you understand things, rambling sous le petit pont, where the long-haired youth sing the most beautiful ballads of our age. And just to finish, I will read I'll read this one. This is part 7. The quotidian can prove as beautiful as heroism. Without leaving one's house, one may know the whole world. The movement of amino acid and the heavenly bodies, traversed by energy, conceiving, how the universe assembled from on high by way of incessant change, and an apple once again an apple, bitten by the blonde beauty, paradise is in fashion, dripping, and we won't reach the other margin, mediators between the world of reality and the world of dreams, still in contemplation. Goats grazing among the rhododendrons, a town of dirty chimneys below, and a hand brushing against oneself can hasten ecstasy, avant-garde of a world we glimpse, shredded by power, which advances over itself and grows from its own self, yesterday and today. In its nature, there is something malignant for now and forever. I'm going to finish just with a poem of my own. Perhaps it may reflect the influences of Rodolfo Nostroza. If not, I'm certain that it reflects the influence of Mexican poetry and of Latin American poetry. This is called The Mystery of Stolen Fruit. The man with slender pockets has a heart that crumples like newspaper. His boots crack ice even when his neighbors sleep on their porches, and heat licks the avenue with tar smoking. Each of his eyes compressed into coal, while the wine in his veins hardens into rope, which he fashions into a noose. He no longer sees the streets for its trees and billboards promoting the vineyards of siesta. He witnesses a murder in some parallel tableau where a yellow glove nailed on Stalin's haunch is the sole evidence. His fingers search his pockets for the key that might open the door of smoke, fumbling for a thread to pull and undo the seams. Until then, a coolant the blue of crushed water inoculates night under his skin. Slow rain needles shut his eyes, and a loaf of bread grows stale at the hooves of the perennial goat. Thank you very much. Muchas gracias.
Likewise, likewise. Thank you for invoking Rodolfo Nostroza tonight with us. And I want to remind everybody, we also have links to titles of our authors' books tonight, both translated and their own books. So feel free to check that out in the chat when we link it. And we are also sharing a PDF of the poems that are being read tonight that you can also access via the chat. To move on with our readings, I want to introduce now Roberto Tejada. Roberto is the author of poetry collections, Why the Assembly Disbanded, Todo en el Ahora, Full Foreground, Exposition Park, and Mirrors for Gold, as well as Still Nowhere in an Empty Vastness. A Latinx poetics on colonial settlement and cultural counter-conquest in art and literature of the Americas. His writings on art and media history include the books National Camera, Photography and Mexico's Image Environment, and Celia Alvarez Munoz, as well as catalog essays in Now Dig This, Art and Black Los Angeles, and Alora y Calzadilla, Specters of Noon. He was awarded the John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Foundation Fellowship in Poetry and serves as the Hugh Roy and Lily Krantz Cullen Distinguished Professor at the University of Houston, where he teaches creative writing and art history. Roberto, bienvenido.
Muchas gracias, Ivan. Thank you, Ivan. Thank you, Ramon and Jimmy and all my fellow writers this evening, and for those who are participating, and especially to Beyond Baroque, which has a personal, with which I have a personal connection. It was very important to me as I was emerging as a young writer in Los Angeles. Tonight, I'm going to read a poem by the great mid-century modernist from Cuba, José Lezama Lima. And I would say that the work of Lezama Lima and the generation of writers that came into their own around the 1980s and 1990s that Tedi López Mills mentioned at the beginning of her reading, that were anthologized in this book entitled Medusario. Many of them were influenced by José Lezama Lima and what was then called the Neo-Baroque. And it stretched from poets like Rodolfo Nostroza, José Carlos Becerra, Arturo Carrera, Eduardo Milán, Tamara Kamensain, and Nestor Pelonguer, just to name a few, Corral Bracho from Mexico. And many of them were interested in this idea that there could be another mode that could turn to the Spanish Golden Age, as Lima did, but turn it on its head in a kind of counter-conquest, but while at the same time using a very hypersyntactic mode, while kind of privileging the idea of curiosity. So it's, on the one hand, festive, but at the same time kind of ridden by anxieties. And you'll see then in this poem that I'm going to read that there's a preference, as in the Baroque, for paradox. It has a kind of carnivalesque sense to it, but primarily it's in excess and in kind of a superabundance, immersive. And this poem, which is long, so I'll only read the beginning in Spanish and end with the last stanza in Spanish as well, has this kind of cascading effect that is ecstatic as it's kind of creating these syncretisms in the cultural bridge that it's extending. And the poem is entitled Un puente, un gran puente. En medio de las aguas congeladas o hirvientes, un puente, un gran puente que no se le ve, pero que anda sobre su propia obra manuscrita, sobre su propia desconfianza de poderse apropiar de las sombrillas de las mujeres embarazadas, con el embarazo de una pregunta transportada al lomo de mula que tiene que realizar la misión de convertir o alargar los jardines en nichos donde los niños prestan sus rizos a las olas, pues las olas son tan artificiales como el bostezo de Dios. A bridge, a remarkable bridge. In between waters frozen or boiling, a bridge, a remarkable bridge that's hidden. But it spans over its own handwritten manuscript, over its own suspicion of its ability to pilfer parasols from pregnant women, with pregnancy of a question conveyed on the back of a mule, impelled to accomplish the mission that is to elongate or alter gardens into alcoves where children lend their curls to waves, because waves are as mannered as gods yawning, like the games of gods, like the nautilus covering a village with its dice-thrown, half-scored inflection, and of animals crossing the bridge with the latest Edison safety bulb. The light bulb happily blows out, and onto the other side of the worker's face I entertain by placing pins, for he was once one of my loveliest friends, and I secretly envied him. A bridge, a remarkable bridge that's hidden, a bridge that was a byway for drunks who claimed they required a diet of cement, surrendered its riches as depicted by a miniaturist, because, mind you, on Thursdays, bridges busy themselves as crossings for deposed kings, unable to forget the last chess game played between a whippet whose microcephalia is reiterated and a great wall that crumbles like a cow's skeleton. Seen through a skylight, geometrical and Mediterranean, led by astronomical numbers of ants, and by a camel made of smoke, a great silver shark must now cross that bridge. In point of fact, it's only 3 million ants that in a momentous hernia-producing buoy lift the silver shark at midnight across the bridge as if it were another ousted king. A bridge, a remarkable bridge, hence it's hidden, honey-colored armature. Maybe it's the Sicilian Vespers painted on a small poster, painted also with a great crash of water when it all ends in the saline silver. We have to cross despite the silent, swollen armies that have sieged the city without silence, because they know I'm there, and I saunter, and I see my wounded head, and the immutable squadrons exclaim, "It's a beating drum. We lost my fiance's favorite flag. I'd like tonight to drift into sleep, poking holes in my sheets." Remarkable bridge, my mind's matter, and the drum rolls nearing closer home. Thereafter, I don't know what's happened, but it's midnight now, and I'm crossing what my heart feels is a remarkable bridge. But the back of the remarkable bridge can't hear what I'm saying, that I was never able to feel hunger, for since I was blinded, I've placed in the middle of my bedroom a great silver shark, from which, meticulously, I break off pieces I roll into the shape of a flute, that the rain amuses, defines, and congregates. But my nostalgia is endless. because such nourishment endures a stern eternity, and its likely hunger and jealousy can only replace the great silver shark I've set at the center of my room. But no hunger, no jealousy, not this animal, a favorite of L'Outremont, ought to cross alone and conceited over the remarkable bridge, because the goats of noble Hellenic descent displayed their flute collection at the last international exhibit, of which today an echo lingers in the nostalgic morning, prone to pilgrimage, when the sea's torso gives way to a small green bedspread and verifies its cabinet of pipes, where so many bats have been set aflame. Carolingian roses burgeoned on the edge of a crooked rod. In the fourth quarter of midnight, a cone of water formed by mules sepulchered in my garden reveals that the bridge wants to fashion such exquisite belongings, little hands of ancient idols, absinthe infused with the rapture of high-soaring birds that mollify the part of the bridge supported over squashy cement, almost jellyfish-like. But now, to salvage my head, it's time for metallic tools to be stunned, mirroring the danger of drool, now shaped into shellfish glazed by the acid of unpardonable kisses the morning tucks into a new change purse. Does the bridge turning only envelop the mistletoe and its olive-colored tenderness, or around the hump and scratched violin that grates the side of the leaking bridge? And morning's campana can't even transform the pink flesh of the unforgetting mollusk into dental notches of the glazed shellfish. Remarkable bridge, unbridled bridge that nuzzles boiling waters and sleep, an onslaught to the flesh until it's rendered soft, and the edge of unexpected moons resounds to the end with mermaids oozing their latest seaside proclivity. A bridge, a remarkable bridge, is hidden, waters boiling, frozen, surging against the last defensive wall to ravish the mind. The single voice crosses the bridge again, like the blind king who, unbeknownst to him, has been deposed, and he dies mended tenderly to the allegiance of night. Un puente, un gran puente no se le ve, sus aguas hirvientes, congeladas, rebotan contra la última pared defensiva y raptan la testa, y la única voz vuelve a pasar el puente, como el rey ciego que ignora que ha sido destronado y muere cosido suavemente a la fidelidad nocturna. That's José Lezama Lima, and it appeared in this collection edited by Ernesto Libón Grossman in a series that our very own Jerome Rothenberg has founded of the Poems for the Millennium. In this sense, what the poems by Lezama, as I've translated them, have kind of infiltrated in this particular hyper-syntactic mode into some of my own poetry. I'm going to read just a short one from a new book that wants to extend the possibilities of what the line and the structure of a syntax can compose in a poem. It's entitled American Household. Here I'm untethered, or else the American household is. A shame for guest and resident alike, torn asunder, immovable, unmoving, horizon line before it closes on the embankment, which is too a slowing thunder. Whether cash and cake were meant for us, the undeserving, in a frenzy of thought, an amusement from the spoils of corporation, able to outweigh the will unnerving, all restraint from the madness or immodesty that coils each milligram back into the sky blue oxy addiction, McKesson, Cardinal Health, and American Marisource Bergen, manufactured for the painless end-to-end encryptions, other plum, for which we are to wait again, our turn in line, and still the others keep cutting ahead of us here, the complected and other-tongued asylum-seeking assembly of the glad in ordinary deliverance from fear. First fuel in the plot that turns us into tyrants unspeaking, yet another dream to make them do what in wakeful hour is lawless, for us depraved and still deprived of power. Thank you.
Thank you, Roberto. Thank you so much for sharing your poem and Jose Lizama Lima's poem. Thank you. I really appreciate that. We're nearing the end of our program with the readings, but just know that there'll be discussion right after this last reading. To close us out, I want to present Mónica de la Torre. Her most recent book of poems and translations is Repetition 19. Other collections include The Happy End, All Welcome, a riff on Kafka's America, and Public Domain. She has translated an array of poets, including Amanda Berenger, Omar Cáceres, Lila Zemborian, and Gerardo Denise. With Alex Poggi, she co-edited the anthology Women in Concrete Poetry, 1959 through 1979. And she is the recipient of the 22 Foundation for Contemporary Arts C.D. Wright Award for Poetry and the 2022 Creative Capital Grant. She teaches poetry at Brooklyn College. Mónica de la Torre, bienvenida.
Gracias, Ivan. Thank you so much. Thank you, Ramon. Thank you, all fellow readers. It's really absolutely delightful to be here with you. I am going to shift gears a little bit and introduce something that we spoke about before people tuned in, which was experimentalism. And in Latin America in particular, I think the distinction between experimental poetry and avant-garde poetry is relevant because the avant-garde happens to be the canon. And it's something that North American readers don't necessarily grasp about the avant-garde, right? Like what happens when the avant-garde is the canon? And that becomes if you're a poet, it is by default the tradition that you learn and you are brought into in the Spanish language. So the poet who I will read some work by is Juan Luis Martinez. Juan Luis Martinez was a Chilean poet who basically, I would say he's in the tradition of anti-poetry to a degree. He really comes after Nicanor Parra, and with Raúl Zurita and he are very important in this anti-poetry movement that draws from every single possible avant-garde, surrealism, Dada, Fluxus, conceptualism, theater of the absurd. In particular, I'm thinking of Juan Luis Martinez's book, La Nueva Novela, which is a book object as well. So it's a brand of conceptual art that's very playful and that's very invested in book objects. And it was the only book he ever published, with the exception of another book called La Poesía Chilena, which is really a box containing the death certificates of los cuatro grandes de la poesía chilena, the four great Chilean poets, Pablo de Roca, Vicente Huidobro, Pablo Neruda, and Gabriela Mistral. And he publishes this book object in the middle of the Chilean dictatorship with Pinochet. So that's an intervention that is like super important at the time. It's incredibly political. He's making a statement about the impossibility of writing poetry at that time. And then a book of poems called La Nueva Novela, which the new novel, which is not a novel, and has the really interesting premise initially in the first section of the book of being a textbook, like a children's book and a primer in astronomy, mathematics, logics, arithmetics, and it has all these kind of really interesting, some surrealist games, and just really interesting propositions about the dialogic nature of poetry. So that's something that I was incredibly drawn to when I discovered this book. You never know when the poem begins and when the poem ends, and that's one of the reasons why I brought up Fluxus, because if a poem is a question to the reader and there's space for you to answer the question in the book, where is the poem? Is the poem the instruction, or is the poem your performance of the instruction. It turns out he was very, very clever, and all those instructions, it turns out, were not his. He was actually translating Jean Tardieu, a French poet and playwright who was very well known for his absurdist plays. And so, but he never tells anybody that these are translations. He just calls that section of the book Problems, Answers to Problems by Jean Tardieu. So it's a really interesting play also on the nature of translation, because in translating this book into Spanish and presenting it, weaving that into his book in Chile, he's also making a commentary on the dialogical nature of translation and transmission of all these movements and ideas about poetry. So I couldn't resist translating some poems in this book, even though I didn't have permission. It is a cult classic, and it still circulates underground. And there's not even a Chilean edition of this book that has circulated after Juan Luis Martinez's death. The books are in the possession of his estate keeper, his wife, and the only way you can access this book is if you know the wife and know someone who can actually lead you to her. So anyway, this is a long preamble to my choices. I will read this poem called Cheshire Cat. And first I'll read some of it in Spanish, then I'll read it in English. And I know that time is of the essence, we're running out of time. So I'll just, without further ado, just go into it. El Gato de Cheshire. It has an epilogue by T.S. Eliot. El nombrar a los gatos es un asunto difícil. Suponga que usted es Alicia y pasa una temporada en el País de las Maravillas. Allí encuentra un gato sin cuerpo cuya cabeza flota en el vacío. Este gato aparece y desaparece a voluntad. Este gato descorporizado ostenta una permanente y misteriosa sonrisa. Usted se lo presenta al rey, pero el rey no gusta del aspecto de este extraño amigo suyo y decide eliminarlo. El verdugo opina que no se puede cortar una cabeza a menos que exista un cuerpo del cual cortarla. El rey dice que cualquier cosa que tenga una cabeza puede ser decapitada. Busque una solución. 1. Decapitar es separar la cabeza del cuerpo. Como el gato no tiene cuerpo, no lo puede decapitar. 2. Decapitar es cortar la cabeza. Como el gato tiene cabeza, entonces puede decapitarlo. I will switch to English in the interest of time. Cheshire Cat. The naming of cats is a difficult matter. T.S. Eliot. Imagine that you are Alice and you're spending a season in Wonderland, where you find a cat without a body whose head floats in space. This disembodied cat appears and disappears at will. It displays a permanent, mysterious smile. You introduce it to the king, but this strange friend of yours is not to the king's liking, so he decides to eliminate it. The executioner does not think a beheading is possible unless there exists a body from which to cut off a head. The king claims that anything with a head can be beheaded. Find a solution. 1. To behead means to sever the head from the body. The cat is missing a body, therefore I am not able to behead it. 2. To behead means to cut off the head. The cat has a head, therefore I am able to behead it. 1. The nature of this cat head prevents its top equal head from being severed from its non-body. 2. Of the cat's body. It is then more an infinity of non-being. 3, and this first part is crossed out, so I'll do this. The cat is the head, the body is the body. Or contrariwise, neither the cat is the head, nor the body is the body. Or contrariwise, the body is the body, the head is not the body. Or contrariwise, 4. The cat's body is up to its neck in the infinity of non-being. 5. The cat head is visible, the non-body, no cat, is not visible. 6. That its body is invisible does not mean that the cat is missing a body. That its head is not invisible does not mean that the cat has a body. The cat's neck is the indeterminate, vacillating point between the visible and the invisible. So that's the translation. And I will just read a short piece from a book, my penultimate book in English, The Happy End All Welcome, which is similarly very inspired by Juan Luis Martinez in the sense that it's very dialogical, and it presents, it's a hybrid book that has some visual elements to it. And it's a play, and it's a performance that the reader is invited to participate in, and also has these questions, exercises, assignments for the reader to perform. And the people running the show, it's no longer the state, the dark, awful, overpowering state. It is a company. And this company is a corporate company, but it's also a theatrical company. So the company proposes this. The human resources manager interviews a candidate for the position of armchair psychologist or pop Freudianist. During the first part of the interview, the applicant is asked to work on various case studies by interpreting the dreams of different subjects. The second part of the interview involves discussing the development of an app for users to log dreams that might eventually be reenacted. These could fall under the five following broad categories: status panic, masochistic ideations posing as sadistic fantasies, total disconnect, catastrophic fear of the collapse of self, or teeth dreams. And then there's a number of case studies. I'll just read you three short case studies. 1, in a vast sun-filled market with large windows and a view of the water reminiscent of someplace in Seattle or San Francisco that the subject has never visited, there is a baker's stall displaying hearty-looking loaves with reliefs of words on them. The subject tries to read one. It could say either pan or pain, but the loaf is cut in half and only a portion of the word is legible. The next day, the subject goes back to the market and asks the baker what a new loaf says. He answers it spells hunger. Was it hombre or hambre? The subject cannot recall. 2, at a party in a country clubhouse, all the food and drink is placed on tables that are impossibly tall, way out of reach above people's heads, so as to keep bugs away. It seems normal to all the guests present. The last case study I'll read. Husband and wife are in bed, each with their respective corpses. These are benign, lifeless, hollow bodies, which makes them appealing to the mice nesting inside them. The subject's dream is heavy with dread. Even though both corpses are stuffed with mice, the husband's has just been cut open. Will the rodents now hide all over the house? Will the noise they make with their unremittingly growing incisors interrupt the silence of the night? What if they sip up the husband's dead body to contain the mice and then release them out into the woods? This raises the troublesome possibility that the subject won't be able to go outside anymore without fearing that they creep up on her. And with that, I will end.
Thank you so much, Mónica. Muchas gracias. And thank you to all our poet translators. We are now going to move to the discussion portion of our program. And for anybody that is joining us, please know that you can post your questions on the chat. We'll have first the discussion amongst the panelists. And as that flows, if there is a question that comes up, please post it in the chat, and we will reserve some time from questions from the audience. But I'm wondering if any of our panelists have a question, an opening question to begin the discussion, as we are focused a lot on specifically translation of avant-garde poetry, both in Spanish and in English. I'm wondering if anybody has and perhaps Mónica, if you were our last reader, wondering if you have a question to pose to the group?
Well, I wanted to maybe start with Tedi, a question. So Tedi, you mentioned that Hugo Gola, for instance, didn't think that there were avant-garde poets in Mexico. But you never told us what exactly you think or what, and maybe I'd just be very curious because you're the only one of us who's actually in Mexico. And so I'm wondering what your thinking is about not only the avant-garde, but the experimental tradition. Is there such a thing? Are they separate? And I'd also be curious to hear about Ashbery's reception in Mexico.
Yeah, can you hear me? It's been a long ride, so I can't even remember what I said. Hugo Gola was a very special, very important influence in Mexico. His magazine was called El Poeta y su Trabajo first, and then Poesía y Poética. And he published Charles Olson, he published George Open, he published Sukovsky, he published a lot of United States, let's say that American avant-garde. No? He published Ezra Pound, he published HD, he published not T.S. Eliot, he didn't consider T.S. Eliot necessarily avant-garde. And he had an ongoing discussion. Not necessarily a present, let's say he didn't speak to Octavio Paz about that, but his enemy was Octavio Paz in a certain way. And in a certain way, for many Mexican poets, the enemy continues to be Octavio Paz. I think we could go on and on about it, but Octavio Paz is still the central figure for good and for bad. And many young poets write against Octavio Paz, against that influence. In the case of, I don't know if that it really answers your question, because your question was many questions. But for example, Anthony Seidman mentioned Jorge Cuesta's anthology, which is one of the most guilt-ridden anthologies that have been published in Mexico. It's still exposed as a kind of, and it's Cuesta was almost punished for that anthology by, for example, by most of his contemporaries and by many of the group of the contemporáneos. And even Paz didn't include Jorge Cuesta in Poesía en Movimiento because the discussion was so terrible, so angry that the contemporáneos were very persecuted by the official poets. That's why I was speaking before we got into the panel about how avant-garde poetry in Mexico has many political issues because the state is so involved in cultural movements in Mexico, and it's so centralized. That's a big difference with the United States. United States culture is not centralized like it is in Mexico.
Can I interrupt, Eddie? Because
yes, of course.
Yes, because actually, I would say until the 50s or 60s, all official literature was produced in New York City. I mean, if you were not in New York City, you were not considered to be a poet or a writer of eminence. And the anthology by Cuesta makes me think by a very important anthology by Hayden Carruth, which is called The Voice That Is Great Within Us. Within, he introduced poets from the deep images movement like Diane Wachowski. He introduced surrealists like Philip Lamantilla, and it was a very polemical type of anthology. I remember people reading reviews. I do my research, where they say they were shocked that for the section of T.S. Eliot, he didn't include Prufrock. He opted to include other poems that he thought that best represented what Eliot was doing. And again, this was very much an official type of anthology that was published by Bantam Press. So, I mean, I think there are some similarities. between
Yeah,
the two.
I don't know.
Yes.
Kind of, I think what Mónica said that was very interesting before is what happens when an avant-garde poet, or let's say an outsider, becomes mainstream. That's something that's always an issue in avant-gardism or poetry that wants to be marginal or begins as something marginal and very experimental and suddenly becomes very mainstream. That's something that might have happened to John Ashbery in a way. John Ashbery was not necessarily accepted. It was always strange. He was always kind of off. And then what you said, and I think it was you that said, Anthony Seidman, that I'm so glad that John Ashbery, I hope Ashbery dies very soon because I'm so sick of him.
No, that wasn't me. That was a professor from my creative writing program.
But in the case of when I say centralized, I mean it literally. The government is in the center of everything.
Yes,
everything is Mexico City. And it would be like if everything were Washington, D.C.
No, I agree. And that's why I think in Mexican literature, I really celebrate the proliferation now of literature from the northern border region, la literatura del desierto, como dicen por allí en México, ¿no? Sobre todo las publicaciones de libros de noir fiction que se trata de la frontera, ¿no? Precisamente para darle una voz de una zona olvidada. Y who was it? Jose Vasconcellos, who said, wherever they start to make carne asada, that's where culture stops, right?
You mentioned one of the figures of Mexican culture, Jose Vasconcellos.
Yeah.
Who became kind of like the center of all that discussion against the contemporáneos.
Yeah.
What happened against the contemporáneos is very interesting as a movement, as an avant-garde discussion around poetry. But that's we could go on and on for hours.
But I have a question.
Interesting.
I have a question for you and for Roberto Tejada and for Mónica de la Torre. Within this anthology by Jorge Cuesta, he chooses to marginalize because of the homophobia of the estrentistas. So were they, do you consider them to be an authentic type of avant-garde movement in Mexican letters?
Yes, definitely.
What do you think? Or
yes, definitely. I think in the case of Cuesta, it was kind of like, I'm going to include all my friends and I'm not going to include anyone else. That was one of the criticisms. And of course, he did not include Maples Arce or the Estridentistas. And that he was very criticized for that. But he continues to be criticized. That anthology continues to be kind of the example of what you should not do in an anthology. And Maples Arce, as well as, for example,
Liszt,
Jose Juan Tablada is another example of an avant-gardism that has political issues as well. No? Well, I think one can always trace those two paths, no? Avant-garde poetry and politics in the case of Mexico. Jose Juan Tablada was he defended Victoriano Huerta, was against Francisco Madero, and he became an avant-garde poet, kind of like to be forgiven for his political sins at the end of his life. No? So that's something that you can say of Maples Arce as well, who was a very strange political figure. No?
Oh, by the way, Ezra Pound. I mean, come on.
Or Ezra Pound, or yes, of course, T.S. Eliot as well.
Or Wallace Stevens. He said horrible things about Ethiopians during the Italian occupation.
Besides, I don't know if you can say that every poet is an avant-garde poet. I don't know if I would say that Wallace Stevens, for example, is avant-garde, as I would say it in the case of George Open or Louis Zukovsky. I don't know. But I think that
very slippery terms.
Right. I mean, I think the thing, Teddy, that gets really confusing is that we're talking about different things because la vanguardia, no, las vanguardias latinoamericanas, the Latin American avant-garde is the Latin American modernism, but not Latin American modernismo.
Yeah. Well, yes.
Right?
Yes. Yeah.
So Vallejo, Neruda, no, fundadores. I remember taking a course with Saúl Yurkiewicz, wonderful person, but like he was always talking about los fundadores de la poesía latinoamericana, no? The foundational fathers of Latin American poetry. I mean, language that is, no, decidedly not, this is not marginal. It never wanted to be marginal, and it was designed to be canonic, even though it was avant-garde. What do you think, Roberto? What do you think?
I mean, I'm just sitting here thinking, okay, so much of this began because of Hugo Gola's comment that Mexico doesn't have an avant-garde. And here's Hugo Gola, who's an Argentine poet living in exile in Mexico for many, many years. And I am allergic to the idea that the avant-gardes are based in the nation state, and that they're only in conversation with the state, right? I mean, in Mexico in the 1960s, I'm thinking of the great transnational project that was El Corno Emplumado by Sergio Mondragon and Martin, right? Which was a true avant-garde in the sense that it was not necessarily defined by a geography or a place, but as a kind of nexus or mode of bringing practices that were experimental, that were not necessarily in contesting the political movements of the state, but certainly bringing people together in a project that meant to revolutionize what was understood to be the possibilities for poetry at that moment.
I agree, yeah. I don't know, we should let the public, or do we go on discussing between each other? I don't know if you were asking me a question, or Roberto, or it was like.
No, I was just bringing up the fact that there's these discrepancies of,
yeah,
when is it possible to speak of an avant-garde, as Mónica was saying, or when is it really that we're talking about experimentalism, right? And these are terms that are often blurred or used indiscriminately, and I think carelessly, in terms of particular movements and formations more than anything else in Latin America.
Yes.
I remember that my dear old friend Jackson McLowe, who was probably the greatest experimental poet of my generation, said, "Stop using the term avant-garde. You know, it's a militaristic term."
It is, that's true, it's true. It becomes a password in a certain way, no? It's when you like a poet, you say he's avant-garde because or she's avant-garde because you like the poet.
I use the term avant-garde too. You know, yeah, Jackson occasionally slip.
I don't know.
And but there's a kind of blurring of distinction between avant-garde and modernist and experimental and.
And also, for example, in the case, Octavio Paz always made the distinction, or always begged for the distinction in the case of modernism, Anglo-American modernism and Latin American modernism. He would always say, we are the creators, we're the founders. Latin America is the founder of modernism, modernismo.
Yeah, well, he was doing that at a time when North American modernism had been taken over by a very conservative faction, which politically was in no sense revolutionary or avant-garde.
But that's also something that you can be an avant-garde poet and at the same time politically conservative. That can happen. The case of Ezra Pound, for example. No?
But by the way, actually, I find that fascinating what Jerry just said. With regards to the modernistas, Jose Marti was for Cuban independence. Mm-hmm. So he was very much avant-garde, revolutionary, independent. We cannot forget that wonderful poem by Rubén Darío, which is against North American imperialism. As much as they were poetas afrancesados, como se dice, they were also very much seeking to position themselves against the imperialism, against the imperial power, while they were writing in very rigid verse and in verse stylized from the French Parnassians. It's a fascinating type of concept, and perhaps when it comes back to the issue of experimental or avant-garde poetry in Mexico. I know that the contemporáneos celebrated Villarrutia for a prose style that was lacking in articles, that was kind of like modeled upon a type of Latin type of rigidity or a French structure. That in itself is a type of avant-gardism. I mean, again, who were they thinking about? I think they were thinking about poets from the United States, how to position themselves against poets from the States, that they were more French influenced, that they were not going to be writing like poets
Or
from
the
the States.
in the case of contemporáneo Salvador Novo, who was very, very much influenced by North American poetry.
Yeah, and I've translated him, and I know he's one of the first translators of Carl Sandburg. And
Yes, he was.
and there's some poems that he wrote that really strike me. They could have been poems written by Edgar Lee Masters or Carl Sandburg. He was very much aware of that. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry about that. I had to turn on my camera for a second, but there are a few questions coming in through the chat as you all, in the context of what we're currently talking about. And there's, for example, a question of if, you know, in this context, putting into perspective the San Francisco poetry scene, Black Mountain writers, and also writers like Rosario Castellanos and Guillermo Gomez Peña, if they are considered to be avant-garde. I'm wondering if
Rosario
anyone here.
Castellanos, no.
Hmm.
I think we also have to, not being an avant-garde poet or writer doesn't mean you're not a good writer. It's not like if excellence was only on the side of the avant-garde. Rosario Castellanos, I think, is an excellent novelist, especially. Balún Canán, I think, is a wonderful novel. But I would say she's an avant-garde writer, which does not mean she's not a good writer. And she's not a Baroque writer either, which does not mean she's not a good writer. That's why the lines become blurred. I think they're becoming very blurred in this, because I don't know if you agree that Rosario Castellanos is not avant-garde. No? I don't know Juan Rulfo. Juan Rulfo is avant-garde? I don't think so. Maybe from a certain perspective, in the sense that you introduce something new into literature. In that sense, you are avant-garde. What does it really mean? Does it mean that you're outside and you go and you barge in? Does it mean that you're an experimentalist? Does it mean that you create a new form, you create a new language? Or does it, I don't know. In that sense, the lines are becoming blurred.
Teddy, for you, for your generation, and for Roberto Tejada, and also Mónica de la Torre, how important were the films that Rulfo did, like La Fórmula Secreta? Like, was that of any deep importance? Like it left a mark as far as visual art, cinema, poetry? No.
More in my personal case, no. His photographs, yes, his photographs.
Okay.
But basically, it's his two wonderful books. No?
Okay, interesting.
And
yeah.
the influence of Rulfo in Mexican literature is overpowering. It even created an anti-Rulfo reaction, no? Which happened in the case of Octavio Paz as well.
Yeah, and here in the States with Ashbery, and
Ashbery.
Also with T.S. Eliot.
Of course.
I mean, yeah.
Of course.
Yeah.
We also have another
something, just because I think I opened this Pandora's box, and I think it is a Pandora's box simply because of the term. You know, it's a historical term that's, from what I understand, very connected to politics always, and it has both a extreme left, extreme right. It can go either way. And there is a, you know, when you add translation to it, there become, you know, there's aporias and conundrums, you know, like somebody mentioned, I think it was Anthony Edgar Lee Masters, which no one would admit to reading these days, right?
No, of course not.
But in an essay, I think it was an essay of Bolaños, he listed the writers that I think it was short story writers should read. He put Edgar Lee Master. So I think that's just some things don't translate well, terminology, culture, etc. But I think what is of importance is this experimentation with language. I think that perhaps is a commonality with, what we call in the US maybe experimentalism or avant-garde, vanguardia, etc. That there's this impetus to advance language, or like in Mónica's discussion of the poet she read, there's an interesting like experimentation of the structure of language and the possibilities of language. I think that's the only way to get out of the combinatora box, because and this is why I wanted to have this discussion, because I wanted to get the sense of how we were seeing it on both sides of the border, and now I do.
And by the way, if I could interrupt, maybe the undercurrent here, especially for Mónica and Roberto, and I mean for everyone here, it's the issue of being a translator as well as a poet. And it reminds me just about, for example, how do we speak about Edgar Allan Poe? Do we speak about Edgar Allan Poe through the lenses of Charles Baudelaire, who really invented a world-class poet, someone of vast importance? If you were to speak about Edgar Allan Poe to a university professor and tell him you were deeply influenced by The Raven and by his short stories, he would start laughing hysterically. Like it's like, this is literature for high school students, right? So I'm curious now. Now I'm questioning myself. So is the Octavio Paz that I know, for example, is he the one that's been presented to me via translation, via New Directions? Or, of course, I didn't grow up in Mexico. I do remember when I was living in Juarez, seeing a coin of 20 pesos where they had the opening lines from his Nobel Speech Prize on one side. And I was fascinated. I said, wow, a nation is, adopting a poet as its official voice. This is wonderful. But now I understand, of course, that must have been horrible for poets living in Mexico. But who knows which Paz I was reading? Who knows which Edgar Allan Poe we're reading? Are we seeing him? I'm sure in Mexico, we're seeing him through the French translation more than through the American original.
Through Julio Cortázar. Cortázar was a translator of Poe, or a reader of Poe. Borges is a reader of Poe as well. Yeah. So I think we're seeing through, at least in my case, not in my case, but we do see him through Borges and we do see him through Cortázar. And at the same time through Mallarmé and Rimbaud and Baudelaire.
Yeah.
Which, well, there could be no more avant-gardist than Mallarmé, no? And
yeah, but Baudelaire's Poe is necessarily different from Poe. And that's part of the power of the translator, for good or bad.
Yes.
Yeah, and that as translators and poets, is it fair game to create new poems?
Of course.
In the process of translating, some would put this off very strongly. I view translation of poetry as the composition of poetry.
Of course.
Though there are other ways to approach the idea of and the practice of translation.
Yeah.
If I could, Jerry, maybe you might talk about the way in which you moved from your translations of Lorca to the ways in which those translations have informed and structured your own work in the variations.
I think that Lorca, who was really, in a sense, my first poet. Certainly the first poet outside of my own language. The first poet that drove me to an attempt, at a translation, to take his Spanish, and do something with it with my English. I mean, I was 16 or 17 years old at the time, and fell for Lorca. And when Robert Kelly and I and others.
Sorry, the doorbell rang.
When Robert Kelly and I and others, came into deep image, certainly, calling it deep image, was a reflection of the presence in our mind of Cante Hondo. So
Sure.
it was that Hondo, imagen, Hondo, not imagen,
Profundo.
profundo, right?
Jerry, what was it that you read first? Was it Poet in New York, or was it that anthology that New Directions put out, which I think was edited by Don Allen?
I forget who was the editor of. I was also looking at the kid. I was studying Spanish, and so was looking. And I think as a class assignment, I also did translation. But Lorca, and Poet in New York, really hit big. But the whole range of Lorca that I could get at,
I think it came out in English very early, or maybe earlier than Spanish.
Well,
The translation.
If it came out when I was 15 or 16 years old, that was very early. Yeah.
All right. Thank you all for this lovely discussion. And I think, we can create a podcast of translating the avant-garde, and everybody can join us for a session of this great conversation. I did see a question here that I think we can close out with from the audience, and I'd actually like to add on a little bit to that question. And this question is about what translation journals and presses that the panelists are reading, are excited about, that have this kind of format. Some of you are published by some of these presses. And I'm also wondering, within the 21st century avant-garde, how is it that, or where do you think that a movement of experimentation within poetic language is emerging? Is it regional, or now that there is an element of hybridity with the print formats as well as digital formats? I'm wondering if that in itself is also avant-garde-ish, and if it is countercultural in that aspect. So who'd like to start with answering that question?
Well, if I can begin just by saying that there are so many resources now for literature and poetry and translation. One could go to Asymptote, which is one of the great online journals for translation. But as far as presses go, for those who are unfamiliar, I would definitely recommend Action Books, that has been the incredible labor of Joel McSweeney and Johannes Goranson, that has brought writers from Latin America, Korea in particular, come to mind, to American audiences that have a particular defined, I think, maximalist aesthetic that would be aligned with the kind of neo-Baroque that I addressed.
I'm sorry, tengo que ir. I have to leave.
Don't worry, Teddy.
Because somebody just rang the doorbell, and I have to leave. I'm sorry.
Don't worry, Teddy.
I have
We are wrapping up.
family. This is
It was wonderful reading with you and listening to you, and it was very interesting. I love the Lezama Lima translation. It sounds incredible, and congratulations. And thank you very much for inviting me. And nos vemos. Viva la vanguardia. Ciao.
Yeah. Bye, Teddy.
Bye. Gracias.
All right. Yeah. Are there any other closing remarks from?
Well, maybe
Our
I'll just speak
panelists?
of another press and project devoted to the translation of Latin American poetry, contemporary. It has to be contemporary, and it's very interesting because it's questioning. It really is kind of like a radical project that seeks the proposals to question what Latin America is. So it's always looking for that which tends to fall off the cracks, seep through the margins. What is exactly Latin American poetry? And what exactly is a translation? And this is Señal. So it's a series put out by Ugly Duckling Press. And there's an open call, and every year at least two chapbooks get chosen. And it's been going for approximately 10 years, and it's a really wonderful resource as well. So I highly recommend that you check it out. Yeah.
Completely.
And if I could just add also, Cardboard House Press, which published a translation of Contra Natura, is doing wonderful things with regards to publishing contemporary poetry from Latin America. Please check them out.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah. Shout out to all these presses. And thank you all so much to all our poet translators, Ramon, to Jimmy Vega, that is in the background, to all our audience sticking around to the end of the program. Thank you so much. Yeah, I think this concludes our program. We'll be recording. We recorded this, so it will be up on YouTube very soon for you to revisit. Muchas gracias.
Gracias, Iván.
Gracias.
Gracias
Gracias.
a todos.
Gracias, Ramón.
Sí. Muchas gracias, Ramón, por la invitación. Isaac,
Oh, de nada.
por tu excelente moderación. Espero que nos crucemos algún día en persona,
Espero que sí, igualmente.
afuera de estas pantallas. Un placer.
Sí,
Fuera del performance.
el mundo real.
Yeah.
And like Jerome says, all translation is poetry. So all poetry is translation.
Poetry is translation.
Absolutely.
I
And
don't
vice
think
versa too.
translation is poetry. That would be going too far.
All right.
Buenas
Good
noches.
night, everyone.
Buenas noches, gracias.
Okay.